Hi, my name's Courtney Hassenfeldt. I'm going to be going over work that was completed by myself along with another student, Jillian, Jacques, and our professor, Ibrahim Baggili. The topic is exploring the learning efficacy of digital forensics concepts and bagging and tagging of digital devices in immersive virtual reality. Quick disclaimer, this material is based upon work supported by the National Science Foundation under grant number 1748950. Any opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this material are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of the National Science Foundation. So now that that's good. On the agenda, we're going to go over a quick introduction, methodology, results, then conclusion and future work. The main question that this whole study was trying to answer was who's better, our professor in VR or a professor in real life? We were trying to see, is VR as effective as a teaching method as it is as teaching in person? So that's what we were hoping to find out. Our contributions from this work is, to the best of our knowledge, this is the first openly available digital forensics teaching a game in virtual reality. This was done via the immersive VR education Engage platform. And also, again, to the best of our knowledge, this is the first experimental study that explored learning digital forensics in VR versus the typical real life physical learning environment. When we started, we had 3 hypotheses. The first one was that there will be a statistical significance between pre and post test scores. All participants took a pre-test and a post-test, same answers, same questions both times. So we were expecting that there would be a statistical significance between the two scores. The second one is that there will be no statistical significance between the pre and post-test scores between the 2 different types of groups. We think that the VR group and the physical group, their pre and post-test scores should be relatively the same. And lastly, that there will be a statistical significance between the average completion time of the participants that are completing the lab in VR versus participants that are completing the lab physically. To start, the VR experience had to be created. This was accomplished by a 3rd graduate student, as well as our professor and the immersive reality creators. So they all designed this, the lab as well as the lecture. The lecture was recorded and those slides were used for the actual VR lecture creation. So the professor in VR is presenting these slides. And the avatar for the professor was created as well. This was originally meant to mirror our professor. It ended up looking like a very skinny white male, which is not our professor. So that did vary a little bit. But that was created, and then the lab experience was designed. So this was designed as kind of a game in a way to capture the attention of the people participating. So it started off with a briefing by a CEO on a case that needed to be solved. And then when the person completing the experience, they would be in a virtual crime scene. So they would be collecting this evidence that's needed. They would be bagging this evidence. And then as they're bagging the evidence, they have to complete some type of like mini task, which is ordering of steps that need to be taken for this evidence, which you'll see later on in the slides. The lecture itself that was created, the lecture was 20 minutes and 22 seconds long. Topics included different types of evidence, methods and tools for imaging, extraction, acquisition, different tools that are used for forensic analysis. It gave a brief overview of hash values, why they're used. It explained evidence handling at crime scenes. It was an introduction level lecture that would be easy for someone to comprehend that doesn't have a background in this type of field, which leads us to our participant recruitment. The lecture was geared towards people who didn't have a background, and we wanted to be able to include everyone who wanted to participate, and not just those that are either in a computer field, who have some kind of background in this. We wanted to get every type of background just to see if this affected how they learned, whether they learned better in VR or whether they learned better in a physical environment. We wanted to try and get as many different perspectives as possible. So our study was open to anyone. We spread our information through a few different sources. We sent out emails. We had tabling sessions on campus. We displayed flyers. Everyone who participated was compensated with a gift card for Dunkin' Donuts. Some students that participated needed to be a participant in a study for their psych class, so they did get psych credit for that. And once we had all of these participants, what we did was we put all of these people into a random list generator, and that was how it was decided which group they got put in, whether it was the VR group or the physical lab group. For the virtual lab setup, we had an HTC Vive VR headset and controller. This was set up in the same room that the physical lab would be held in. We were trying to keep as many variables the same as possible. So one thing we did was we did make sure that the room was set at the same temperature throughout the entire experiment, no matter which part was being held. And we chose 73 degrees because that was a different study that was done showed that that was the optimal set temperature for learning for the most people. So that's what we used. And then what they did was the participant would come in, we'd have pieces of paper over a desk, and they'd be face down, and they would pick one, and that would be the participant ID number. This was done so that it was anonymous. The people researching didn't know which answers went with which person. At the end, that was shredded before they left the room, and they would take that participant ID, they would go over to a computer that was separate from the VR setup. They would complete the pretest on that computer. And once they were done, they would watch the lecture in VR, and they would complete the lab in VR. Once they were done with all of that, they would then complete the post-test. And then after that, they were done with the study. The physical lab setup, it was very similar. We tried our best to keep them as close as possible. So again, they picked the participant ID number. They completed the pre-test on the same computer that those doing the VR setup would be doing. And then the difference was, instead of watching the lecture in VR, they would watch the lecture on YouTube. Once they were done, they would complete a physical lab setup. So off to the right of the screen, you can see this is the physical lab setup that we tried our hardest to mirror the VR one. So for instance, the filing cabinet in the left of the photo, this is where there would be a USB. We did that because in the virtual reality game, there was the USB hidden inside the filing cabinet. We tried to put everything very close to where it was in the game, just to keep things the same. Then it brought us to the ordering part of the lab, where as participants collected pieces of evidence, they were then given this ordering to complete. And what happened was, for instance, for a flash drive, they'd be given the different steps that had to be taken with a flash drive to go through. And what they would do is they'd put these in the correct order in the VR, and when they were done, they would submit the answer. And, excuse me, after they submitted the answer, it would light up the ones that were correct green and the ones that were incorrect red. And we wanted to, again, mirror this as closely as possible. So what we did was we took magnetic strips, put the same steps on those that you would see in the game, and they used a metal cabinet, and they would list out what they thought the correct order was, and then we would go over and we would mark them with either green check marks or red X's, and they keep on going and refixing it until they got it right, the same as with the game. In the end, we had 57 participants. The majority of them, 94.7%, were 18 to 24 years old. The other 5.3% were 25 to 31 years old. And then for gender, a majority were female at 64.9%. A majority were white at 71.9%. And as we mentioned, we were trying to get different backgrounds. So we were able to get some from varying backgrounds. However, a majority was from the criminal justice and forensic science program. For the pretest, they were given 15 multiple choice questions. Each question had 4 different answer choices. For the pretest, there was a 7.26 average for the correct answers, with a standard deviation of 1.92. The minimum score that anyone got was 3 correct, and the maximum score was 12 out of 15. When it came time for the post-test, they were given the same 15 multiple choice questions, and we saw an increase of 2.7, more being correct in the average test. So the mean went up to 9.96 with a standard deviation of 1.79. The minimum went up to 7, and the maximum went up to 14. We ran a t-test. This was done to see if there was a statistical significance between 2 different groups. In this case, since the p-value was less than 0.05, there was a statistical significance between the 2. And then this chart right here, I'm just going to move this over here. We compared the different groups. So what we did was we grouped all the males and all the females together. So the males on average scored slightly lower than females, but when we ran a t-test, it wasn't a statistical significant difference. So on average for the pretest, there was a 7.16 average for the males and 7.41 for females. Again, with the post-test, females did score a little higher with 10.19 compared to the 9.68 for males. We did the same thing for the VR versus physical groups, and again, we didn't see a statistical significance between these test scores. So for instance, the VR group on average had a pre-score of 7.23, whereas the physical had a 7.31. Not that much of a difference, but the physical group was a little higher in the pre-test. Same with the post-test, they were slightly higher at 10.15 compared to the 9.81. Sorry. Okay. So the participants that completed a VR experience, they were then asked other questions related to the VR experience. First thing was, how was the lecture and lab completed? We asked this to see if a different way that the lecture and lab were completed affected their test scores or affected their learning. So 25.8% completed it sitting down, almost 13% did it standing, about 32% did a mix of sitting and standing throughout the lecture and lab, and 29% sat for the lecture and then stood for the lab. We did find that this didn't make a difference. How they completed it really didn't matter, statistically at least. And the next thing they were asked was, did it feel like they were in a room? 93.6% of the participants agreed to some degree that it felt that they were in a virtual room. So these were measured with the Likert scale. So the 93.6%, this is ones that strongly agreed, or somewhat agreed with that statement. They were then asked if the VR experience made them feel dizzy, lightheaded, or nauseous. These are common things that could happen when completing VR experiences. So we wanted to see if that played a part in anything. 29% agreed to some extent, 12.9% neither agreed nor disagreed, and 58.1% disagreed to some extent. So we did see that some did experience, a little less than a third did experience dizziness, lightheaded, or nauseousness to some degree. Excuse me. So the virtual reality lectures should be integrated into a college courses. That was the next question they were asked. So 51.6% did agree with this statement to some degree. So strongly agree, 16.1%, agree 16.1% again, and some would agree 19.4%. 19.4% also neither agreed nor disagreed with that statement, and 29.1% disagreed to some extent. So over half did think that integrating VR would be a good idea for college courses, which was interesting to see. So in conclusion, we didn't see any statistical difference between learning in VR versus the physical lab environment that the students or participants completed. For the first hypothesis, we did see an overall increase in the test scores between the pre and post tests. So there was a statistically significant difference between the two. For our second hypothesis, there was no statistically significant difference between the pre and post test scores between the VR group and the physical group. So we didn't see any difference between the two. Like you saw on the chart, there was a very slight difference between the two, but nothing of significance. And with the third hypothesis, there will be a statistically significant difference between the average completion time of participants in the VR lab and in the physical lab. We did see this. We saw that the VR lab did take statistically less time than the physical lab. This could be for numerous reasons, but we did see this. And then for future work, we would like to complete the same kind of study, but on different lab experiences. So this would be completing it with different types of labs other than just bagging and tagging, as well as with different age groups. We had a very high percent, almost 95%, that were from 18 to 24 years old. We would like to see how, especially older age groups would do with this. But that, again, would be something for future work. So If you have any questions, you can ask them now, or you could contact me or Dr. Baggili. I put both of our email addresses here, and that would be it.